So we are really honored that Bill Seaman has joined us for this afternoon session. He's a professor emeritus from the University of Florida. He was one of the founding members of our Fisheries and Aquatic Sciences Department. He was also with Florida Sea Grant for quite some time. And his research and technology transfer emphasis has historically been on coastal fishes, habitats, and fisheries. He's contributed to developing the scientific basis for the design of purpose-built or artificial reefs. And Keith mentioned the new volume that he has just recently released that he'll be talking about a little bit today. And we also have some handouts at the front of the room that you guys are welcome to take with you if you're interested in getting that book. And he was also one of our keynote speakers at the Florida Artificial Reef Summit, which we appreciated too, and it was virtual. So thanks for joining us again today, Bill. And without further ado, we will let you kick us off.
Okay, thank you, Angela, for the introduction, and a big thanks to Keith for the invitation to participate today. I'm speaking from the mountains of Western North Carolina, and I've really enjoyed this morning hearing about the great work in your area. I would say, having known John Stevely from just about his very first day on the job with Florida Sea Grant Extension, I want to say how much I appreciated this morning's very moving memorial, just beautifully done. So with that said, I realize that with baseball spring training in full swing in your area, some folks may be thinking of things besides Reef, especially right after lunch, Angela. So Angela put me in this afternoon's leadoff spot, a tough position for an old timer. But I'm going to suggest that we might imagine together that we are sitting in our box seats at a ballpark. It's rain delay, and we have found an old newspaper still dry under the seat. And its feature is, you guessed it, Artificial Reefs of the World. So, with your indulgence, I'd like to present a fairly rapid-fire headline-style review that includes a front-page feature, some exclusive late-breaking science reports, and the ever-popular editorial. You already are holding the ad insert with some of the most valuable information of the presentation, I think. Our front-page feature story reports where the action is. The red and yellow dots indicate research sites described in journal articles between 1968 and 2018. And on your handout page, the Lima 2019 article is cited for you to look up. The darkest colors indicate countries producing the greatest numbers of articles. And about, as of now, 2023, 60 to 70 nations are represented in reef work. And I have seen, particularly over the past years, the Australians are especially active. When we say that human-made reefs are not just for fishing anymore, this underwater art installation in Spain tells the story. Here, Jason DeCaris Taylor and associates created a museum for snorkelers and scuba divers. In several other places in the world, sculptures also serve to divert diving pressure from coral reefs. These artists are well aware of the science and reef effects of purpose-built structures from my conversations with them. Meanwhile, some of the other purposes of structures deployed on the seafloor include, top left is an anti-trawling unit in Spain. To the right, we have large concrete modules used in sea ranching in Korea, then a surfing reef in Australia's top right. Bottom row, excuse me, we've got an ornamental fish module from India, and then the large structure in the middle bottom is one of the older established deep water reefs for commercial fishing in Japan. And then you'll notice the resemblance to it of a United States fishing and diving platform that's being recycled. You'll hear me use terms such as human-made reef and purpose-built reef in this presentation. And in fact, there's a slight trend in more recent literature to get away from the term artificial reef. In fact, for many of the purposes, we can simply use a name to say what the reef is intended to do. In other words, what kind of a reef is it? A surfing reef, aquaculture reef, habitat restoration reef, and so forth. Just something to think about. This picture of a restoration reef module from Southeast Florida is my basis for asking the 3 questions listed here on your screen. They concern biomimicry, and biomimicry is another term gaining popularity in the literature. So what does the natural system imitate or emulate or biomimic? What ecosystem services are sought? And then the question that bugs me is, when do artificial reefs stop being artificial? So here in the image, clearly the bottom of the structure is poured concrete, human-made, but then the material are limestone boulders, and clearly you can see species recruitment and abundant colonization that has occurred. This figure, also on your handout page, offers in its particular way what I call the smoking gun concerning equivalency between human-made and natural reefs. In a nutshell, Avery Paxton et al. Analyzed 39 research papers from around the world. They reached the conclusion that for the 4 open quote fish metrics analyzed, there were not statistical differences for density, biomass, species richness, and species diversity for fish assemblages associated with the reefs. This is a lot to digest, but again, you've got the figure and the source on your page. 2 other important papers I listed on your handout come from Claes and from Cresson, and I would like to just quote the first from Claes. And they write in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, oil and gas platforms off the coast of California have the highest secondary fish production per unit area of seafloor of any marine habitat that has been studied, about an order of magnitude higher than fish communities from other marine ecosystems studied. So as we move through our newspaper, we've got an investment column. Where's the downside? So far, we've looked at some success stories, but at this point, let me address some of the downside of reef development, or the potential downside. The items listed on the slide certainly would warrant a whole presentation. So for the record here, I note failures of materials and on-site placements as being an issue. There's a danger of over-harvest, lack of access restrictions, back to what you heard about the status of fishery management. There has been a lag in the comparisons of reef systems. Again, we heard from Chris on that. Lack of evaluations according to objective success criteria is a major issue. And then there's the potential for greenwashing. Particularly a colleague of mine is concerned about greenwashing the benefits of restoration reefs. 2 others that occur to me are the potential of reefs serving as stepping stones for invasive species, and there's a small body of literature on that. And then also simply, what are we covering up in the underlying system? So with that said, let's turn to our technology corner and think about the design and fabrication that we are hearing about increasingly with design modules. This image comes from my colleagues in France and Monaco, and they have been experimentally producing these 3-dimensional computer printed models. And again, there's a small literature developing with them. Meanwhile, excuse me, along more traditional lines, there's a considerable body of literature that has quantified complexity of physical structure as a principal consideration that drives the reef effects of seafloor structure. Think of the old real estate term, location, location, location. It is really important in design to consider how many holes, crevices, and internal spaces of different sizes there are in reef modules, and how up and down the vertical reef profile is. So again, complexity, complexity, complexity. Here's just one example. These diagrams come from the French Mediterranean Sea, and the empty Reef module on the left was the control. It was modified with the addition of building materials, as you see on the right. And for a long-term study of fishes, the modified unit showed twice the species richness, 2 to 3 times the biomass of fishes, and in fact, two protected species of fishes only showed up on the modified unit. Okay, turning to the human interest section, citizen science. It is really important, I think, to stress the vital role that trained laypersons are finding and can find worldwide as citizen scientists. Well-trained volunteer divers are proving to be qualified and invaluable partners for monitoring and assessment of purpose-built reefs. And I would give a big shout out to Victor and his group in the Big Bend for the various efforts they're doing with citizen scientists. Just well done. So to start wrapping up, here's my busiest slide, but you've got it all on your handout. This is my editorial and opinion. The sheet before you lists the 5 standards that RAM et al. Have identified. They've proposed to further the direct comparison of seafloor structures. And so as you read through the list, they have criteria for identifying information, deployment properties, physical properties, and objectives and monitoring. So I commend this proposition to you as an important step toward better comparison regionally worldwide, and again, ultimately more rigorous evaluation of reef performance. Okay, finally, let's consider 2 grand challenges worldwide. And the anglers shown here are talking to each other, and they've kind of seen the end of the world. And I'll tell you what this means, Norm: no size restrictions, and forget about the limit. And they've got an attitude of dismay, but we well know how many dedicated people are concerned with ocean conservation and enjoyment. The people in this room, for example, and we want to take positive actions to address 2 grand challenges facing the marine environment. The first challenge is responding to a warming, acidifying, and rising waters of the sea. And so, again, in going into the literature recently, I have found that human-made benthic structure is starting to appear, even slowly, as a subject mentioned in the literature concerning response to ocean climate change. In 2018, Gattuso et al. Described 13 possible solutions for addressing rising ocean temperatures. 4 listed here have seemed to me to offer the possibilities for employing purpose-built structure, although, again, realistically in limited ways. And I'll just refer to the first one, the restoration and conservation of coastal vegetation. And here the authors are using the term blue carbon ecosystems to talk about enhancing the carbon sink capacity of vegetation. In other words, coastal vegetation growing on reefs can capture carbon. And then the second challenge is the increasing amount of hard infrastructure on the seafloor. For example, seafloor pipelines pictured on the bottom here. There are 26,000 miles of pipeline in the Gulf of Mexico alone. Plus, there are thousands of coastal protection breakwaters, such as pictured here. And these are just 2 of the components of a largely commercial infrastructure that has been said by one authority to have a footprint on the worldwide spatial scale on the seafloor equal to the land area of Italy. That's right, the size of Italy. Your handout page, again, provides a great indication in its bullseye circles of the spatial scales of various structures. So in response to this, what some folks call ocean sprawl, there is developing a vast eco-engineering network worldwide, both nonprofit and commercial, aiming to what I call complexify historically simple designs. And what I show you here comes from an experimental offshore energy farm in Sweden. The bottom monolith you can see is plain concrete. The upper monolith has holes built into it to enhance recruitment and settlement. So to sum up, I hope that my little newspaper has served for more than just a virtual mullet wrapper. We have reviewed some scientific and technological advances that have furthered development of human-made reefs or artificial reefs and identified some shortcomings. We've identified documentation of biological productivity and provision of ecosystem services and recognized over 20 purposes, perhaps some new to you, that reflect a growing diversity of stakeholders. And we have looked ahead to possible roles of purpose-built structure in addressing emerging grand challenges to the ocean. So thank you very much for your attention.
I'm sorry, Bill, you didn't hear all the applause. It just happened and I hadn't unmuted yet. Applause again. Can you hear me, Bill?
Yeah, I'm just lost getting back to my screen.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm gonna ask the audience if they have any questions for you, and I'll repeat the question into the mic.
Okay, you can hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, great.
He's been not taking the cue. Well, Bill, thank you so much. I have a question. Where did you find that Far Side cartoon?
I think I did it the way anybody would. I browsed for artificial reef cartoons, global warming. And if any of the new timers in the audience didn't recognize the style, that's Gary Larson, and I didn't put the credit in there, but everybody knows Gary Larson, who is an aquatic biologist in California by training many decades ago.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, Sean Keenan has a question for you, Bill.
So in your research of global efforts in the artificial reef community and development, how do you feel that the United States and Florida is doing comparatively?
I could hear that.
Oh, good.
How is Florida and the United States doing comparatively, right, to research worldwide? I think, well, Florida probably sets the curve as a state. You know, in terms of when you hear of Chris Stallings and that holistic approach he's taken, and then you go to other centers around the state. I mean, clearly we sort of have a critical mass. I'm really impressed by the Australians. They've been very innovative with research techniques, like they're using baited video camera systems just as one means of monitoring abundance. And of course, there's a bias, but otherwise they see species they never would have seen otherwise. They're addressing the question of sprawl. There's an author, Catherine Dafforen, among others, James Tweedley, and they're extremely productive. The Chinese have really been publishing a lot in the last few years. Europe is kind of steady as she goes, you'd say. Those are maybe the most prominent places. And if, Angela, if we had a minute to address the international conferences.
A minute. Yeah. 1 minute.
We heard this morning that the last conference was 2017 in Malaysia. The ball was handed off to a group in France, and they basically dropped the ball. I'm in regular contact with a principal in the academic world, and basically the international community is back to square one. And I would think that a combination of people from the United States, Florida, and maybe Western Europe could really organize a wonderful program.
Okay. Fantastic. Bill, yeah. Oh, Hayward has a question. Real quick,
Bill.
Hayward.
Middle 70s. Back in the middle 70s, you guys funded the Florida Sea Grant Artificial Resource Team. It's happened all around the state.
Can you hear?
No.
Okay.
How much
So-
that grant? How much was? I can't find anybody at Sea Grant that's been there long enough to know.
Do you remember back in the 70s, Bill, at Florida Sea Grant, you guys funded the Florida Artificial Reef resource team that
Mhm.
Dr. Hayward Matthews was asking that question. Do you remember how much money you gave to St. Pete College in the 70s for that effort?
Oh,
And if you don't, how do we find it? Because we can't find it in the archives.
yeah, I mean, it was minimal back in those days. A lot of people were pretty cheaply. So, you know, a few thousands of dollars maybe that covered travel expenses. This was kind of like a SWAT team of experts from different campuses who would visit the Big Bend or Southwest Florida to advise local reef builders back. And this was in the infancy.
So Hayward, we still don't have an exact number for you, but we'll find it. And
Yeah.
it sounds like you were a cheap date back then. All right, Bill, thank you so much. We're gonna have you stop sharing, and we're gonna take over sharing here and get the next speaker set up, which is Ed Camp. So you might want to stick around.
Oh, I'll be here.
Okay.
All afternoon.
All right, great. Thank you again for joining.
You're welcome.
Okay. Ed, come on, hurry up. Come save me from myself. Okay, okay. All right, Ed, take it away.
Hey everyone, thank you for coming to Angela's very nice summit. Thank you for staying to listen to me talk. I don't know how long this is going to take, so we're going to time it on the run, and hopefully it won't take too long. I do a bit of my name's Ed Camp. I'm an assistant professor at University of Florida. I have research and extension is what I do. Extension is like outreach. Some of you know that very, very well. Some of you don't need to know that. That's great. So I work with a couple of people. I'm not going to focus too much on them or the actual research I'm doing. I'm going to give sort of a higher level talk and summarize what we're working on here. I work with a number of grad students. Lisa Chong is one of them whose work you're going to see a little bit of here, but it's, again, high level work. Also work with a number of the Sea Grant agents like Angela and Scott Jackson and Victor, and obviously we're coordinate with Keith quite a bit with FWC. We're doing a couple things with research on artificial reefs. Most of it's quantitative modeling. So it's trying to actually estimate or quantify benefits to fish, benefits to fishers of doing this habitat alteration, but a bunch of it's also extension. One of the things that we do with extension is we try to summarize a lot of the research that is out there and make it available and useful to people. That's what I'm mostly going to go over today. So the front part of the talk is I'm basically going to give you the main points of a number of outreach documents that me and others, some of them in the room, have written. And then there's going to be some frequently asked questions stuff, and I'm going to go over some of the questions that I think pop up a lot. But what I would suggest, I'm going to try to answer those questions, but if someone here doesn't agree with my answer, or has something else to add, I'm just going to open that up and you should chime in. And also if there's other questions in general, obviously you can ask them too. So that's the setup here, relatively informal. I'm going to use this acronym EDIS. I'm going to try to not say it. They're outreach documents. EDIS is the name within the University of Florida. It doesn't matter at all. But basically, if you ever hear me slip up and say EDIS, I'm just talking about these outreach documents that I'm going to tell you about here. You don't have to read their titles because we're going to go over each one of them, but there's some of them, 3 sort of general ones, and then 4 that are in a big series here. So this first one was basically just an overview that tried to wrap up, and there's a model that you probably don't need to read, but it's the purpose of this is try to organize how different groups of people are affected by reefs and how the different groups of people affect where the reefs go. So some of you probably know this super well, which is basically who needs to be contacted if we're going to actually implement a reef, where does the approval come from, where does this start, where does this finish? And some of it other people of you are super aware of, which is, well, the artificial reef, sure, it's doing things to the habitat and affecting the fish, but it's really potentially going to influence the economic impact to the county, which is going to be jobs and total direct revenue. So the main point of this thing was that artificial reefs actually are connecting with more groups of people. We focus on fishers and divers, but it's probably a bigger deal to some of the local businesses, especially if they're fishing or diving or tourist oriented. Things that you probably know, most people think positively of reefs. Things that have been mentioned a little bit here and have been mentioned at previous ones is reefs can have unintended consequences, which is, you know, we do this semi-permanent alteration to the habitat. It's hard to remove it, for example, the tires, and then some things can happen and sort of beyond our control what goes on with that. We'll talk more about that later. I'm not going to talk about what they're useful for is. You can read that yourself. You can decide if it's useful for you or not. The second one was recent, and this was following up in the Artificial Reef Symposium that Angela spearheaded, that happened in 2021, 2020, wow. Basically, the main point of this is that in the last few years, similar to what Keith started this, we've seen a lot more artificial reefs, especially in the Western Panhandle. But the other trend that's interesting is we've seen a trend around the state towards more shallower reefs. And these shallower reefs aren't only like snapper grouper. Some of them aren't even fisheries. Some of them are diving, snorkeling, restoration. That's been going on more and more. And I think it's actually a trend that's mirrored around the world. It'd be good to get Bill's input on that. This third one was, to me, actually really fun, which was just like a poor man's literature review, right? So we went around and we found papers that we thought were really neat on artificial reefs, and we summarized them and we wrote them up in this document so that people who don't have access, because almost all these journals are behind paywalls, who don't have access to this can go read a summary of the paper without having to go wade through 20+ pages. And some of the things that we took away from here is what there were actually some ecologically meaningful differences between artificial and natural reefs. It wasn't all the time, right? So Paxton's review found that overall, if you looked across the world, there weren't differences in these metrics. But if you focused on the subtropical waters, there was actually less diversity around the artificial reefs compared to the natural reefs. And a lot of Florida's waters are going to fall in that category. And other work, like some work by Hilkema working in the Caribbean, showed that different actual structures of reefs are going to attract different fish communities. So there are differences between the reefs. One of the other things that came out of this is that increasingly what we call an artificial reef is getting used as some form of structure, whether it's a FAD or a deep water reef, to attract pelagic open ocean stuff. The other thing that came out of this, mentioned in Chris's talk this morning, Chris Stallings' talk, is that artificial reefs typically have much more effort, and there's evidence that they should have a lot higher catchability, which basically means more people are fishing them and they're catching more fish per unit of effort when they're on artificial reefs. And that has big implications, getting these unintended consequences, right? Artificial reefs are really good at helping people catch fish, and they may be more good at helping people catch fish than they are at increasing fish populations. So these next four, and I'm moving quickly through here because I want to. This is with this little series, Artificial Reefs 101. All of these are available online. There's URLs up there, but it's if you Google EDIS artificial reefs, you're going to get a list of them. It's very simple, and University of Florida has actually done a really nice job of making sure they get indexed and that they show up in the first page of Google. No one wants to go to page 2. What this focused on is actually why the reefs are put in. And this is important because when I'm talking about reefs from here on out, I'm mostly talking about these reefs that are designed for fisheries, whether that's spearfishing or angling. They're looking at, you know, your snapper grouper complex, but that's not the only reason they're done, obviously. Some of them are just pure habitat alterations, like we saw this morning with artificial reefs, oyster reefs fringed with the reef balls. And some of them, like a lot of Bill Lindbergh's work, was specifically for research. So there were multiple justifications here But for the most part in the literature, the main justification is this concept that we think they're going to increase the habitat and recreational opportunities and help the fish populations. And is the key thing there. It's hard for these things, for artificial reefs to do all of these well at the same time. And that's what these next couple ones get at. Starting with this, the second part in this series was how they affect fish. And the main point in this is that the easiest way, or the most impactful way that artificial reefs can change the fish population is if they give fish more habitat for recruitment. That basically ups the carrying capacity. It's a bigger hammer than a change in growth or even a change in survival. It's a bigger deal. So if an artificial reef is actually mimicking the recruitment habitat, that's a big deal. But most of the reefs that are put in are not doing that. It's actually really challenging, because I've tried to find any peer review literature that says any recreationally or commercially targeted fish recruits on artificial reef. There's some evidence that maybe vermilion or lane snapper might a little bit, but it's really tough to find. Red snapper, maybe the first year that an artificial reef is put out, there's some work showing that, but it's actually remarkably difficult to find evidence in the literature that commercial sport fish recruit on these offshore artificial reefs. What the artificial reefs do is they attract fish. And so the question should be asked is why? Like, the fish aren't stupid. They've evolved over millions of years. They're hopefully going to be in good places. It suggests that what some of these other studies have shown is that artificial reefs should help increase the survival or increase the growth of fish. It's just that these effects probably aren't going to translate to massive population changes. They're likely to be still. Overall, artificial reefs should help fish populations if we don't consider fishing, right? If no one fished on an artificial reef, you put them in, should help fish populations. The thing is that artificial reefs were justified, back to that first one, as not just helping the fish populations, but also these recreational opportunities. And so what we expect is that artificial reefs are almost certainly increasing the catchability of the fish, how easy it is to catch them, probably angler satisfaction, and these things feed into angler effort, right? It's not exactly simple because, oh, the catch rates go up, that's great, but then what happens? More people come fish them. Catch rate is it's a fraction. It's the number of fish caught over the amount of effort. So as the effort goes up, your overall value of that fraction decreases, right? So there's some feedback there. It's not super simple. But probably our biggest effect here is this change in catchability. It's easy for the anglers to find the places where fish are, and the fish are actually aggregating, gathering to those places. So we suspect the catchability can be really high. Mandy Karnauskas has a paper where they estimated catch rate of red snapper and artificial reefs was 17 to 20 times higher than on the natural reefs, which that's a really big effect. So when we pull this all together, and when I was here some number of years ago, we worked on this concept of a balance scale. Basically, I completely agree with the comment, that Dr. Fortone made this morning about this isn't an attraction versus production. It's both and it's really which side weighs out more, which side is heavier. Can artificial reefs increase the fish population more than they're increasing the fish harvest? I'm not aware of places that have actually demonstrated that yet, which is interesting. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen. I'm just not aware of it, not seeing it in the literature. The most likely scenario, I think, is that artificial reefs probably increase fishing mortality a little bit with a slight negative effect on local fish populations. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. The only problem is if you're dealing with a fish population that's already really close to its overfishing threshold, right? But if you're not, no big deal. It's like putting a fish attractor in a pond when the bluegill aren't overfished. Like, we have good fishing, no problem, everybody's happy. It's just really important, I think, for as scientists and when we're talking to the public, to be honest about what we think these reefs can do. And it's probably pushing it to expect them to be able to have really big effects on the fish population and on the fishing. And there's other feedbacks that I'm not going to go into now. So how much time do I have, Angela? 6 minutes. Okay. So these were some of the frequently asked questions. I mostly work alone in the office. Nobody's asking me questions. But these are the questions that when I do venture out of the office and see other people, other human beings, that sometimes I'm asked questions like this. So I might take through a couple of them, but I'll give an answer. And then if other people want to chime in, you're welcome to. So, do artificial reefs help fish populations? they probably can. The net effect is they probably have a slight negative effect on them because of the fishing. That really changes when you move away from these offshore reefs that are aggregating snapper grouper complex and you move to more shallow water things that are snorkeling oriented, that are made for restoration. That answer completely changes when you move away from artificial reefs to help fishing to just artificial reefs to make the habitat better to protect the shoreline restoration. Someone just raise their hand if they have differing opinions about stuff. Yeah.
I agree it's very complicated, but the premise that we're catching more fish because the effort is better. If we have fisheries management that says we have a limit on fishing, it's not plausible that people are just spending less money on gas, catching their limit and going home, rather than just exploiting the resource. I don't know how that feeds back into it, but you're assuming that the artificial reef is magically allowing people to take more out in their boat. And maybe the case in the Philippines where you have no regulations, but is that same in the States where we have other mechanisms to control our overall harvest?
Two things on that. First, sure, it's plausible, but it's plausible if people were like, I got my 2 gag for the year, I'm done. Right? Or I got my 2 snapper for the day, I'm going home. Sure, I spent $100 on gas getting out here, but I caught my limit, I'm going home. I don't do that when I fish, and I don't know how many other people do. The other more concerning thing is, sure, but we manage for the actual total harvest, and our main sledgehammer that nobody likes is season length. So if we're getting to the harvest season length sooner, is anybody happy about that? Because that's less trips, less dollars, or the trips and dollars are concentrated in a small window, which is usually, all else being equal, less good for the local economy because you're getting a slug of people right at once. So it's possible. But because we don't actually limit at all in Florida or in the States the amount of fishing trips, we limit the amount of legal harvest. We have discard mortality. We have fishing out of season. My friends are going and hitting gag now because it's fun and they can do it, right? So like these things go on. So it's plausible. I'm not sure that it's likely. And the other thing is, even if that did kick in, what we're talking about is shorter seasons, which people don't like.
For my master's thesis back in 1966, I found that with the shallow artificial reef off Panama City, the artificial reef produced more carbon per acre per year than a basic grass bed. Dr. Pomeroy studied both the that. So when the voting comes, it actually increases primary production, the algae population.
Yeah, for sure. This is not to say that artificial reefs don't have a positive effect. We know that they increase primary production. They help the nekton and the small animals, and that's wrapped up in us assuming that there's an increase in either growth or survival. Fish ecology mostly thinks we have sort of survival and growth are 2 sides of the same coin for a fish. The bigger you get, the fewer things eat you. So, but also the more you forage, the more you get eaten. So we think that artificial reefs are having a positive effect. The issue is just, is that positive effect enough to outweigh an increase in catchability that might be tenfold? And that's the challenge. Sure.
Maybe another thing to consider, down off of Lee County, and it's probably similar down in Southwest Florida, everywhere. It's basically sand out there, right? You do your natural ledges, so on and so forth. So now you're adding substrate, you're increasing carrying capacity, and you're increasing places people can fish. So, and do you think fishing pressure would actually increase, or do you think it would actually just, you're almost diluting, because each reef might get, and I forget which talk it was earlier, maybe it was Chris's talk, where you were relieving some of the pressure on the natural reefs by having the artificial reefs that are fishing. So if you add more artificial reef area, would you actually end up, the fish have more places to spread out, you might actually reduce the fishing pressure because each site's not going to get hit as often.
Yeah.
Or is the economy going to increase so more fish are going to be?
This is a good question. This is the last one I take, so we're at peace. This is a super interesting question, and the short answer is I don't know. I haven't seen a single paper that actually tried to show what the regional effort did with artificial reefs, right? Because it's really hard to see, and most of the time Sure, it's a permanent habitat alteration, but it's such a tiny proportion of the actual bottom or the overall habitat that we're changing. But it's possible, either one is possible, and we just haven't seen which one. My suspicion is you'd have to have a lot of reefs before you get that dilution effect, because we have really good bottom machines, pretty mobile anglers. Travel distance on red snapper is like averaging hundreds of trips to get to the port. That's how far away people are coming from. So people are willing to travel quite a long way. The other thing you said was increasing carrying capacity. So jumping down here, I don't know, one of these questions is, yeah, which implementations would most increase fish? If you put artificial reefs in an area where they're going to actually increase that recruitment habitat, where they're going to help those, 3 to 5 inch snapper or those small gag grouper, it's not going to help your fishing a ton, but it is going to increase your carrying capacity. And that should have an effect, especially if you can pull it off at the massive scale that some of these countries like China are doing. So sure, if we wanted to basically terraform, offshore of Naples, we can have an effect. It's tricky because we actually need to know what habitat those fish use for recruitment, and we're not super clear on that for things like snapper. I think we know more for gag, but it's a really interesting question, and I'm happy to talk more with you about that or with anybody else about these other questions. I'll be here. Thank you.
All right, so you guys know where to find Ed. If you have more questions for him, catch him before you leave today. Our next speaker is another treat, Sean Keenan. He's a scientist, a research scientist with FWC's Fish and Wildlife Research Institute. He's got a very comprehensive position. He leads field crews in the estuary as well as offshore. His team does a ton of offshore bottom mapping, which is really fascinating, and he's going to be sharing some of that work with us today. And come on up, Sean. Oh, yeah.
I just used the habitat mapping to get my foot in the door. Gonna talk a little bit more about the broader program of offshore monitoring.
I think our Zoom died. Did it die? Ryan? Man, you guys are so quiet. It's freaking me out. Okay.
Right. So the G Fisher program is relatively new. In 2020, we were able to get a Restore Science Program grant to expand and bring together an offshore reef fish monitoring program, and habitat mapping is a component of that. And I'm going to go over how that is implemented into this broad scale program. So long-term monitoring data. We've heard a lot about monitoring, and the group understands that monitoring data, if done in a standardized fashion, is useful for assessing stocks, assessing reef fish populations, whether the populations are increasing or decreasing. Allows us to see changes in relative size composition. So population could be level with the number of fish that are there, but changes in sizes are important to that. They also allow us to look at, get information on things like perturbations, whether it be short-term perturbations like the Deepwater Horizon spill or red tide effects, or whether it's long-term perturbations, long-term changes in the community, such as invasive species or changes in ocean temperature.
It also allows us to look at some efforts of recovery through restoration efforts. So long-term monitoring, when placed into overall scheme of an estuarine system or of the Gulf system, allows us to get an idea of effects of restoration practices. So reef fish surveys in the Gulf of Mexico have been going on for decades. So we utilize a stereo-baited remote underwater camera system, as was mentioned before, used commonly in Australia. I'll talk less. It gives us information on relative abundance of numerous fish taxa that are in the area. And we utilize stereo cameras. So 2 cameras positioned at an exact distance apart, kind of functions as the human eyes. Using computer software, we're able to measure fish wherever they are in as they're seen by both camera lenses. So it bypasses the need for laser systems. So in the Gulf of Mexico, the challenge is that we're trying to assess fish populations for multiple species. So you probably heard about efforts to count, one fish species, the great red snapper count, or what's going on now, the greater amberjack count. But we all know that there's multiple targeted species out there. So our goal was to establish an assemblage level approach. So we're looking at not just the red snapper, but also the tomtate and the scamp and gray snapper. So we needed a project that would generate data on multiple fish species and multiple habitats. So as I mentioned, the reef fish sampling has been going on in the Gulf for many years. The blue blocks shown here are the National Marine Fisheries Service out of Pascagoula. They have a long-term monitoring program where they would set cameras on reef habitats predominantly along the shelf break. This was back into the early 90s. The NIMS Panama City Lab in the green blocks began sampling in the early 2000s using the same camera systems on natural reef habitats that were identified there. And the FWRI group started assessing reef populations on the West Florida shelf in that gray box. And then through a NIFWIF grant, we were able to expand our sampling to go from the Keys essentially to the Florida border. So we were able to contribute to the data set that had already been moving along, following the same methodologies. So the challenge with working in the Eastern Gulf was there was no comprehensive habitat map. We couldn't go out there and say, we want to set cameras on particular locations because it just didn't exist. So we generated a methodology for identifying and collecting data in a standardized way across our entire sampling frame. And we utilize a side scan sonar and we do small scale surveys. So we randomly select starting locations and then we would do a 2 square kilometer survey. It takes about an hour and a half. And then we pick up the towfish, move to the next point, and we do that for thousands of surveys across the Eastern Gulf of Mexico. Is it efficient? No. A lot of our crews really didn't like it. They were like, this is not good, but it was representative. So even though the data that we've collected is about 6% of the Eastern Gulf, it is representative of the habitat that's out there. Now, we were targeting both trying to find prospecting for natural reef habitats, which is kind of the long, skinny surveys. But then we also wanted to know the information of what was going on around known artificial reef habitats. That was part of our sampling frame, part of the habitat that we wanted to target. So the square boxes, a selected artificial reef was in the center of it, and we would do our 2 square kilometer survey. We wanted to know what was going on around it. Was it just sand or was there other habitats around that? And all these surveys helped build our sampling universe. So the sonar processing is kind of a multi-step process. The nice raw data that's on the left-hand side where you can see, very small, fine detail. That's useful, but it also has issues with like navigation. There can be some offsets. So we go through a post-processing routine to get a geotiff that's shown in the middle. We have technicians that follow a process and are trained to go in and identify individual reef fish, reef habitat features, draw polygons around them, and then in the end, on the right-hand side, we get a map of habitats. So the different colors would represent different types of natural hard bottom. We do this for every one of those surveys, and then the star white represent where one of the underwater cameras are deployed. So this would give us an idea of where to set the cameras, but it also gives us an estimate of what's the distribution and composition of habitat throughout the Gulf of Mexico, Eastern Gulf. So there's a whole nother presentation of how we get here. I'm not going to go through that, but these are almost 6,000 camera points that collected through the course of our studies. And what we did is we evaluated the fish communities, the reef fish communities observed by all these cameras, and we grouped them into what communities were more similar, trying to develop a sampling framework. So if the colors are the same color, that indicates that the reef fish communities were relatively similar. What that analysis gives us is a sampling frame. So this breaks up that universe into areas that exhibit similar species communities, and that's going to guide our spatial stratification. So we have in the Eastern Gulf, we have 3 different regions, and we have 3 different depth strata. But that's just part of it. We also want to bring in the habitat data. All those individual side scan surveys also contribute habitat information, and we wanted to put the cameras on different habitats to collect the different assemblage information. I'll start with artificial reefs. For these habitats, we divided it into 3 relative relief features. So through the side scan, we can identify pipeline, rock piles, reef modules, construction materials, and these were divided into relative relief areas, relative relief features. Then we looked at, well, what's the distribution of the sizes of each of these? And this plot shows along the axis is the relative frequency, along the y-axis, and the x-axis along the bottom is the area. So for artificial reefs, they generally are mostly small scale. 25 square meters is about for a lot of the features. We identify every little thing that we are able to go over, okay? And then there's more in the medium, 25 to 100 square meters, and then fewer in the large. But these categories, we assign sampling effort into each of these so that we make sure that we're capturing something that's small scale, but large in coverage, as well as something that might be a high relief feature, but it's really small. Similar to that from the natural reefs, we assigned different habitat types into relative relief categories. We do the same thing with the areas. You can see with the natural reefs, they're generally overall larger in size. So our sampling strata, the habitat strata here are a little bit different. But again, comes down to 9 different habitat classes based off of relief and area coverage. So we put all that together and it creates our sampling frame. Okay, so about 1,500 deployment sites between the Keys and North Florida. The green dots represent natural reef habitats. The red dots represent artificial structures. And so that is conducted starting in 2020 was when we started this program, and we're working on this for the next 5 years and hoping to get a renewal project. The gear that's utilized throughout the entire Gulf of Mexico is a sphere cam. It's a 360-degree camera. So inside that pod, it's hard to see in this picture, but there are actually 5 cameras all oriented orthogonal to each other. And when you put it all together, you can see the 5 individual lenses. When those are stitched together, it's a full 360-degree view. So if a fish were to swim off the left-hand side, you'd see a tail on the left-hand screen and a head on the right-hand screen. So we're trying to get an idea of what we're missing by just looking at one lens. So these cameras allow us to see in the entire way around. And it helps with when there's small habitat features, if there's a habitat, in front of the pod, but the camera's looking two different directions, we might miss them. So this allows us to help that. So back to the mapping for a second. One thing that we did incorporate in 2018 was we wanted to get a better idea of habitat change. We questioned the mantra of map once, used many times. We didn't know how much relative change is occurring out there. So in about 10 to 20% of our mapping effort every year is rescanning. So we're scanning in areas that we've previously scanned before and seeing if there's changes. This is some examples from Hurricane Michael. As was mentioned before, this tower from 2017, you can see in the lower left, and it moved 400 meters after Michael. Geotiffs on the right-hand side in 2017, the two areas that are circled in red and orange, there was a concentration of reefs, and after the hurricane, they were kind of distributed in a northeast direction, following the path of the storm. We have conducted rescanning in some of the areas off of Charlotte Harbor. So after Hurricane Ian, so we haven't gotten into those data yet, but it'd be great to compare notes on what we're seeing in before and after. So to conclude, the G Fisher program started in 2020. We'll go through 2024, and we have a renewal process set up for this coming fall. It incorporates natural and artificial reefs. We're stratifying our sampling to represent the habitats as well as the areas. We are going to continue our mapping efforts and remapping efforts, and provide distribution of habitats as well as composition of those habitats. So it's important that I also wanted to point out that the data that are collected from this are directly incorporated into the federal stock assessment CDAR process. So information from these cameras are being put into use for stock assessments. Nice thing is that we don't make the decisions, we collect the data and then we can pass that on. Obviously, it takes a lot of effort to put things like this together. We receive funding from lots of different sources, and it's hard to describe the amount of people's time, staff time that work for the state of Florida that have dedicated to hundreds of hours offshore and in the lab, as well as post-processing the information. And yeah, I just put this in there, Angela, this for you. That Goliath, I'm not sure what it was doing, but it was doing rolls, standing on its head, and it was fine. It was swimming around, but yeah, that was an interesting one. Plain possum, yeah. So I'd be happy to take any questions. Yes. We don't house the information online. The data are available, but it is at this point it's not housed in a specific location. But a lot of it is available. I've worked with county groups to if artificial reefs were thought to go into a particular area, Keith will contact me and we'll talk about, do we have any mapping data within that area that can inform of some of those efforts. So the data are available, it's just not served online right now. Yes. It's a random process. So in January of every year, I run a series of programs that looks at all of our habitat data. It's a two-stage process. A grid is selected that has the habitat that we're after. And then once that grid is selected, another GIS process goes through and randomly picks the habitat that we're targeting within that grid. So it's a randomized process. Those points every year will change a little bit, but the randomization is kind of the cornerstone of what our what our survey does so that we can get, good unbiased data. And the pods are custom built in-house. They're about 250 pounds. They have water quality sensors on them. We're also collecting eDNA. But yeah, they're pretty stout. Good. Thanks.
All right. Thank you. Our next speaker is Ryan Schlesser. He's been with Moat Marine Laboratory since 2015. His research interests include various aspects of population biology and ecology for estuarine and marine fishes. He's done work with stable isotopes as well as the temporal and spatial dynamics of estuarine fishes. And he's recently been very associated in habitat associations of a lot of our nearshore species. So thanks, Ryan, for joining us today.
Thank you, Angela. So today, I guess I have the privilege of giving that token talk that seems to be coming totally out of left field as I share a lot of my work, bringing you away from that offshore habitat into the estuaries, all the way up into our tidal creeks with our shorelines, because that's where we do a lot of our work on these species-specific habitat use patterns and associations. But hopefully some of the concepts that I'm sharing today, like the fishes that rely on our estuaries and then ultimately grow up and move offshore, maybe these concepts can start in the estuaries and help you with some of the artificial reef issues that you're trying to address. So here we go. Two of the key objectives of our fisheries ecology enhancement program that I'm going to be touching on today are: one, our goal to develop and test responsible marine stock enhancement strategies. This is where we're working with our model species, the common snook, so that there was a mass mortality event, we can be proactive and give those hard hit locations a jumpstart on the way to recovery. But what this work also allows us to do is use these hatchery reared fishes as ecological probes of habitat quality. Places that are expected to give high survival of our naive hatchery fishes are probably pretty useful for those savvy wild fishes as well. We don't just work with hatchery species. We also have part of our program looking to advance knowledge about wild fish habitat use, their movement and survival patterns. And with that, we're monitoring natural, altered, and restored habitats throughout Southwest Florida. So I think pretty much anybody that you showed a picture to in this room of Southwest Florida, they'd be able to pull out some of these high quality fish habitat ranging from the emergent marshes, seagrass meadows, mangrove lined shores, sand flats, and obviously the hard bottom reefs many of you work on. However, maybe not everybody would be pointing out some of these potential habitat features, right? And in terms of hardened structures, but in one sense, these are those low productivity, low attractive artificial fringe reefs that form the baseline of that spectrum. And because they have that low complexity, they're going to provide a very different habitat type for different species and size classes than what we would really target for an artificial reef. But we should probably start to consider these in terms of their fish habitat potential, because all the way back in 2015 already, up to 50% of our tidally influenced shorelines have been hardened and altered in some fashion. So these are those productive nursery habitats that now have turned into these low complexity shorelines that are pretty well recognized to lower abundance and diversity of those species that we care about. And the reason is pretty simple. They offer less protection and have fewer prey resources to support our economically and ecologically important species. Fortunately, there's a really strong desire among a lot of stakeholder groups, all of them present in this room, in order to restore some of that shoreline complexity and promote those healthy coastal systems. Now, whether that's best done through something like a full-blown restoration or some type of shoreline habitat enhancement, in order to get the biggest bang for our buck for those species that we care about, we're really talking about the need for a species-specific or maybe an assemblage-specific measure of habitat productivity. And that's kind of one of the questions that our team is working with. And in my world, that means it's time to start tagging. The tool that we primarily use is the passive integrated transponder tag. This is the same type of tag you probably have in a pet back home. We use it because it has a very specific identifying number that we can associate with an individual fish, meaning that we're actually able to, with our stocking work, take a fish, track its life throughout the hatchery, throughout any pre-release conditioning experiments, through our release protocols into the wild, and for that fish's entire life once it's released. We basically have the same opportunity to do that with our wild fishes. So we use it as a tool to assess survival and habitat use of a suite of different species. We use pit tags because we're working with these tiny little juvenile fishes, but the same type of concepts would apply for people who are more accustomed to large-bodied fishes through acoustic tagging. The way that we get the data from our pit tags, we can use recapturing, but often if we have to take a team of 4 to 6 people to pull nets all day long, we'll be lucky to see maybe 6% of those fish again after a huge amount of effort. So we've really been relying on these pit tag antenna arrays because they actually allow us to see up to 80% of our fish again at some point in time. The way that they work, you obviously see the solar panel. So they are solar powered. That keeps a battery bank continuously charged so that it can operate a microcomputer that communicates with up to 4 of those antenna loops that we'll have at very specific spots in these estuaries. Often those antenna loops are monitoring a very specific habitat type, say an artificial reef, but we can also design them to form gates. So we can look at how fish move through different features or into different habitat areas, as long as the restriction is 80 feet or less. That's pretty much the largest area that we've used. But the point is, anytime one of those tagged fish swims over that loop, we know exactly which individual of that species, the size when they were tagged, when is that species size class at that spot, how long were they there, and most importantly, we obviously know that they're still alive. And when we put all those recapture pieces of data together, this is an example from one of our stock enhancement experiments we did in North Creek way back in 2017, I believe. What you're seeing is the minimum proportion of those fish we released that must have survived because we saw them there. So if we saw fish on day 36, clearly it survived 35 days. And the reason I'm showing you that 35 days is our market capture model suggests that at 35 days, survival is high and constant. In other words, our fish are part of the population now, and they're really emigrating from the system. And we're actually really pleased with up to 40% survival at that time period. Why I'm showing you that is because if you see those symbols in blue, those lagoonal habitats, those are the habitats that are kind of towards the lower part of these tidal creek systems. They are entirely mangrove lined. They are one of those ideal high quality fish habitats that you would pull out of that first picture. The rest of them, same system, but you're just going a few hundred yards upstream where you're back into more of the people's backyards. And in this case, still totally natural habitat, not hardened in any way, but not the same type of complex structure that you would expect from the mouth of the tidal creek. When we do releases in totally hardened structures, it's the same type of dynamic that you see in those red symbols. The point being is when we can align the species and size class with the habitat of interest, we realize the benefits of our efforts. However, if you're going to misalign the species, size class, or those habitat types, you may not really be realizing the benefits of what you're trying to achieve. So if we extend that to artificial reefs, what are the species and size classes that we're targeting? And are we getting them in the exact areas that we would expect those fish to be used? Because certainly something will be using that habitat, but do we realize the full potential if we're missing that size, species, habitat alignment? To transition a little bit into that second objective of our program, habitat monitoring, here you see a picture of Robinson Preserve. If you haven't been to Robinson Preserve, just across the river, a little bit west, beautiful restoration, completed just over a year ago, I believe. And our team is using our pit tagging approaches to monitor fish habitat use throughout this. Each of those red circles indicates an area being monitored by one of our arrays. And these water bodies, I should say, were specifically designed to be a type of representative natural fish habitat. The north water body is one It's actually separated by a culvert, but it's one that's connected very intermittently. Only at really high water events does that really connect well. Then you have a designed nursery habitat on the west side with a single axis, relatively restricted. The southernmost nursery habitat has 3 different axes of various complexity that we're monitoring. And then in that southwest corner, that's the main way in and out of the restored habitat. And each of these systems has 3 or 4 loops. So we're monitoring that connection. And also we extend one of them out into the middle of that water body to see who's using that habitat. And we have been out in Robinson Preserve seining for about a year now. We've tagged over 1,000 fish of pretty much any species that's large enough to get a tag into. Obviously, we're targeting those commercial and recreationally important species, our snook, tarpon, drum, but we're looking at other top predators like crevalle, ladyfish, and even some of our large-bodied prey species like the mullets and mojaras. The purpose of this work is to inform that restoration design so that if we wanted to improve redfish habitat in the area, well, what are those habitats that we see red drum using and contribute to their survival and emigration from this system ultimately? And here's just one snippet of the types of data that we're getting from this work. On the y-axis, you see each of those individual tag IDs associated with the fork length of that fish. And over the course of the year, each of those symbols represent one of those habitats that those fish were using. So if you look in about mid-March, you might see a lot of those dark gray diamonds. Those are fish that were emigrating from the preserve. They hit that last array on their way out, and many of them weren't seen for a while. Some actually came back, and then they started occupying a variety of different habitats. The green and blue are those different nursery habitats that fish were moving in and out of. Some used one, some used the other. Some went between the two. Some never even entered one of those nursery habitats. You'll also see all the purple. That's that low connectivity water body. We tag fish in there. Some were happy to stay, circle around, find prey, hit our antennas. Others took advantage of that high water event associated with Hurricane Ian, right at about that October, and it left that feature. Others left the main preserve itself. Some returned, some didn't. If we were to extend this into the artificial reef world, imagine this type of system monitoring either single reefs or arrays of reefs, where you can look at fish and how they move amongst these different habitat components, these artificial reef structures. Which ones are they moving to? Which size classes, which species, and which of those habitat use patterns ultimately contributes to those fish's survival? Other insights that we can maybe draw from this work that could benefit artificial reefs, on top of just trying to better inform the design and arrangement to promote some of those species-specific benefits, include things like co-enhancement. It's not really used much here in the United States, pretty common across the world, especially in places like China, as we kind of heard. And that's where you're really stocking alongside your habitat enhancements. So for example, if you're putting out this fresh habitat and you're co-stocking it with either a finfish or shellfish of interest, you're really transforming that location into more of a put and take fishery. Just like artificial reefs are drawing that fishing activity to that particular location and alleviating some fishing pressure on maybe those natural reefs. Well, in this case, it's another way of alleviating fishing pressure on the natural stock, the wild stock, because you're putting that more on some of these stock species. We can also use this type of approach to identify and validate the habitat improvements that we're expected to make. For example, here is just one thought of a project that our group is working to pursue in order to quantify some of these species-specific artificial reef types of associations. You can imagine a habitat choice experiment where you have different structures or different compositions of the same type of structure, and let certain species of a certain size class select for the different types of habitat that might actually be attracting to that species. Well, how does that habitat use pattern when you change when you have a different fish density or a different arrangement of size structure within that particular species? How does that habitat fish selection change when you have a multi-species component? If we can understand that in a lab and associate the different complexities, structures, and arrangements within a reef in that type of situation, take it out into the field and validate whether or not you see those same types of habitat use patterns. And ultimately, I think this could be an important way to inform the placement of these structures to align with, again, that target and life stage of interest so that we can realize and maximize the benefits that we hope to achieve. And with that, I know I'm running out of time, so thank you for letting me come out of left field with my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Yeah.
What size snook are you guys using the pit tags? I know there's some telemetry also going on, probably larger fish, but.
Yeah, so we can pit tag snook as small as, we use a 12 millimeter tag if they're under 120 millimeters. We've had survival fishes as little as 60 millimeters that we've tagged with pit tags. But we'll tag anything as large 60 millimeters, yes, centimeters. We tag a lot of fish. We're pretty good at it, but we'll tag anything as large as I think the one you saw was 780 millimeter snook that we tag with a pit tag to look at its movement throughout the ray. Same thing with most of the other species, although it's a little different by species for that smallest size, depending on the belly cavity space. Yes, sir. No, so I showed you that because the primary interest is the short-term effects, right? After that 35 days model suggests survival is high, most of your losses occur really early on. These are lifelong tags, and we still see fish coming back to these release sites, kind of like a salmon, 5-6+ years after release. We only see them 5 to 6 years after release because that was 2017 and it's only been 6 years. So we'll continue to see them return, and obviously it's fewer fish because a lot of those snook are actually moving on to different habitats. Some of them just happen to return to their nursery system during winter and happen to cross some of those antennas. So the encounter rate is much lower, but we'll see for years. All right, thanks, guys.
I'm learning so much today. I hope you guys are too. I'm gonna Frank and Jason, do you guys want to rock, paper, scissors? Or Frank, do you want to go first? Okay, okay. Frank Gaitis is with CCA. He's the CCA Florida Director of Habitat and Environmental Restoration. He was also the principal scientist and president of Gaitis Ecological and Environmental Group. He's a Florida native, not very many of us, and he's decades of experience in environmental and marine resource issues. And we're going to take this next 30 minutes or so to talk about some new initiatives that are going on in this region. Frank is going to kick us off, and then Captain Jason Stock is going to give us an update on some of his efforts. So thanks for being here.
So I apologize to Angela and Keith because it wasn't until yesterday when I opened the agenda and saw my name on it that I realized I would be speaking today. So I kind of just threw this together pretty quick, but I appreciate the opportunity to be up here. For those of you that don't know, CCA is a 501c3 nonprofit. We've been around since 1977. We're a national organization. We were first started in Texas in 77 due to the overfishing of redfish and trout in that area. And then since then, we've added 19 state chapters, and Florida is one of those. Florida was started in 1985, and our focus has been since the beginning on fisheries advocacy, and that means healthy fish stocks, access for fishermen, stuff like that. So it wasn't until really the last 7 or 8 years where we put a huge focus on water quality and habitat restoration. And that's kind of where we really got into getting into artificial reefs and a number of other inshore habitat projects. I want to talk about two briefly that we did last year. We did it with Walter Marine, the Dr. Bart Carey Memorial Reef. It was off of Carabel on the Carabel 10-mile reef. Just a really cool partnership project between OR, the Organization for Artificial Reefs, and CCA and Walter Marine. This one, we had 46 structures that were placed very strategically on the bottom. And these ranged from 15-foot structures to 8-foot structures. And then literally 30 days later on the same reef, we deployed the RZ Sandy Safley reef. And Sandy is actually still alive. He was out there for this deployment. It was really cool. He's a former House of Representatives from Florida, 1988 to 1998. He spent his career fighting for healthy fisheries in Florida and among other things. And so we were really, honored to be able to do something like this for him. This was, I'm actually going to thank Walter Marine right now again for pulling this off. This almost didn't happen because the whole family was in town on this specific day. And I think Walter Marine and some other folks thought it was going to be the next day, and they actually got down here in time and pulled it off. It was really amazing. So a couple upcoming projects I want to talk about real quick. The top left, this is a project in Beach County in FWC. FWC has supplied the grant money for this, and CCA has kicked in $20,000 for the memorial module. This is the Bob Burton Memorial Reef. And this is going to be a 20,000-pound module that's going to be surrounded by 2 large piles of limestone. So we're really excited about that. And then also with Palm Beach County, this is running a little behind schedule. We were hoping to have this deployed last year, but it's definitely coming up this year. We're sinking a 109-foot tugboat called the Aloise. And that's also going to be in Palm Beach County. What's going to be really interesting about this deployment, and I'm really excited about it, is you're actually going to be able to watch it go down from the beach. It's only 3/4 of a mile offshore. And it's in a location called the Delray Dredge Hole, which is a 90-foot hole. So this is going to, I think, garner a lot of attention and media and stuff like that. And we're really excited about it. It's actually in Merritt Island right now, and it's getting ready to be towed down to Fort Pierce to be cleaned. And then we have some other upcoming projects with some other counties. I know Mark Edwards had mentioned an inshore project that we're working on with them and Larry Beggs and some others. So we're excited about that. And just to mention, before I jump ahead, our contribution to all this is it's a little bit different in that we're able to provide funding for these projects, and we're able to, in a lot of cases, provide materials. Our funding comes from several sources. We're a grassroots organization, so we have, from our membership, from our fundraisers, and from private donations. And we also, in 2021, got a Florida specialty tag approved. And so we get $25 for every tag that comes directly to our habitat restoration fund. And so that's where a lot of our money comes for these artificial reefs and other projects. So like I said, we were founded in 85, and from 85 to 2015, I think CCA had done about 10 or 11 habitat projects. And then in the last 7.5 years, we've done over 70. So we've made a real serious commitment to habitat restoration, both artificial reefs and, like I mentioned, inshore. I mean, we're doing, the oyster reefs, living shorelines, clams, you name it. We also have our own oyster recycling program. I know there's a lot of folks from different counties here. I know we've donated to several of you. We donate these at no cost. We have a recycling program at the Lake County landfill. They gave us a 1/4 acre to use, and we dry the shells out for at least 6 months. And then we have our own dump trailers, and we'll take them anywhere in the state of Florida and donate the shells. So we're really excited about that, and we're actually getting ready to ramp that up too and double it in size. And then I'm not going to go through all this, but just really the first three relates to artificial reefs. We've done 6 vessels that we've deployed, over 7,000 tons of concrete and rock, and a total of 46 artificial reefs, and that's since 2012. And lastly, for us, it's all about partnerships and being able to leverage those funds. CCA in our national habitat program called the Building Conservation Trust, we've donated a little over $1 million to this of our own money, and we've leveraged that to over 9 million statewide. So that's really important to us. And these are just some of our partners. I know there's many more that are here and that I didn't have time to put it all together. But anyway, I just wanted to emphasize that the partnerships are really the key for us. So that's really all I got. I appreciate it.
Don't go anywhere. Questions for Frank? Oh, you gotta have a question. I'm gonna ask you one if nobody else does. They're just thinking.
What projects you guys got going right now, like locally?
We have a lot of like ongoing projects. Actually, one of them I'll mention that I didn't mention before is in addition to like the actual habitat projects and all that, we'll fund research projects. We've done quite a few, and we just recently funded a research project at UCF. Dr. Linda Walters is doing a study on Haliduli radii in Mosquito Lagoon, and it's a genetic study. And so we funded that. And so stuff like that, especially the seagrass right now, is a really big focus for us, you know, especially with the loss, not only statewide, but especially in the Indian River. So.
And you guys have that one right by the Green Can near the Glen Marina, or the one right by the shrimp boat to the south of the Green Can. They did that like a couple years ago.
Oh, the Scott Gookin Memorial.
Yes,
The Sean Guckin Memorial.
Sean.
they have that one's like a barge and a bunch of concrete structure and stuff like that. So
Yeah, that's off of Manatee County.
Yeah.
Yeah.
it's like 4 miles out to go.
You've got one from Chuck.
Yeah. Hey.
Question for you, I'm just curious on your oyster, you mentioned that you have an area, where you're able to bring them and drive them out. Just curious, how are they collected?
Well, so that's a good question. Right now, we have one oyster bar in Claremont, and they are huge. They're doing about 1 ton to 1.5 tons a week donating to us. And so we keep a dump trailer parked right outside the restaurant. They fill it up, we cover it, we take it to the landfill and bring it back. That's been going on for about 5 years. We just bought a second dump trailer, and something else that is really it's just beginning. We don't know where this is going to go, but we've looked at what Maryland's doing with their tax credit. So if you turn in a bushel of oysters in Maryland, you get a $5 tax credit, and it maxes out at $1,500. And so that's really encouraged restaurants to donate. And so that's something that we may look at trying to get done in Florida, something similar anyway. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you, Frank. I'm introduce you. So our next speaker is Captain Jason Stott. He is with Full Send Reef Habitats. He also operates a fishing charter company by the same name. And Jason has been fishing his entire life with over almost 20 years of full-time professional experience. He has done a lot. He started out in a kayak, taking people out charter fishing in a kayak. And one of the things that I like to share about Jason is he's been doing cooperative research with fisheries biologists with FWC since he was a pup in the kayak, taking clients out. So he's recently started this Full Send Reef Habitat initiative for creating artificial reef habitats. He's got some of his board members in the audience with him today for support, and I'm gonna toss the mic to him now.
Thanks, Angela.
Yeah.
Let's give a round of applause for Angela, though. You know, she's been like running around like crazy, just getting everything organized. I think she's starting to chill out. We're on the downward here. But anyways, like it's great to be here, and it's great to kind of meet everybody, shake a hand, have a face with a name. You know, we've been talking with Keith, been talking to Carter. I went to that survey deal. I get the gag study, met you there, and you know, it's good to interact face to face. But so we got some exciting stuff in the works, and the biggest thing now we surveyed some of the zones. One of the zones we've talked about and kind of, I think, landed on for the first project was close to the fin barge. So it's like 20-ish miles from Anna Maria. We were surveying some of the stuff, and we got some of the surveys from FWC on some of the areas that did not have live bottoms. So it's not interfering with any of the structure that's pre-existing there. I mean, I make my living off of artificial reefs, and I've had stellar fishing. I mean, I fish artificial reefs almost every day. And the biggest thing is, you know, I've heard a lot of different people talk today is like different contour, different things to attract different species of fish. Well, guess what? They don't live there all the time. They move. You know, some of the commercial fishermen will say, you know, these fish got tails with no homes. So they're just kind of wherever the wind takes them. I mean, even after the hurricane, we've had a lot more mutton snapper and dog snapper and blacks and yellowtails and stuff that came up from the south, and that's from a hurricane. And now we're in the next natural disaster, red tide. So how do we try to help that? And then I heard somebody say at the very beginning, I think it was the older gentleman, and they were talking about Panama City, how the water is crystal clear due to the huge abundance of artificial reefs that are essentially filtering the water. So you start with that, and our water quality, that's our number one issue. I mean, I've been to a lot of these meetings with regulations and this and that. If we don't have good water, we don't have a fishery. We're all just going to be bummed because everything's dead. Eventually, like, let's be honest, like the growth is crazy. We're losing our natural shorelines, it's seawalls, and then we have another spill of septic that goes in our waters. And I mean, I'm not being negative, but I'm saying that we could turn into a positive by getting more filtration and a different variety of habitat. And what I've noticed in definitely guiding is with clients on the boat, their goal is to, number one, get on the boat and have a fun day. So how do I do that? I start the day, I'm like, what do you guys want to catch today? And they'll throw out, I want to catch a Goliath grouper. You're like, all right. And then sometimes if it's too easy, then you got to kind of mix up with other things. But I can kind of move from spot to spot, and then I can selectively harvest fish for my clients. I don't need to kill a million fish that day if they don't need it. So I kind of feel them out. I'm like, how many people do you need to feed? What are your intentions? Would you like to catch action fish? Would you like to try for large fish? Like, for example, this winter's been probably the best African pompano fishing I've ever seen in my life. And I mean, could have been from the hurricane again. They all pushed up this way, but they're here. And there's millions of amberjack, which are not endangered, and barracudas and other cool stuff in the mix. You got tuna, wahoo, caught a sailfish Monday. There was a great white on an artificial reef yesterday. The great white tracking, they're all facing in. Stuff's moving around. We got spring. So, you know, definitely fish are mating and eating and traveling. And if you fall in the water, you're probably going to get pregnant by something. But you know what I mean? Like everything's moving, and I'm just being honest. There's a lot of stuff going on. When you see it, it's pretty neat. I mean, our permit fishery is amazing this time of year. They just showed up, so I'll be messing with those for a while. And I don't have to harvest those. Like sometimes you can keep one, or some of my old time guys. Like I had one of my clients day before yesterday. He's 91 years old. I've been fishing him for 20 years. I used to paddle him around in a tandem kayak. So it's cool. First of all, he's still alive. Secondly, it was blowing 20 knots out of the northwest, and it was like 4 foot. He still was like, let's go. Like I was talking to his son, I'm like, dude, it's kind of rough. So we put him in a beanbag, got him out there, and actually I got a cool video. I'm like chatting with him because his son even said, he's like, it might be his last one, you know, which is heavy with a dude that's like my grandpa, essentially, or a dad kind of figure. But the cool thing is, I'm doing an interview with him, and we're fishing the 7 Mile Reef, no secret. I mean, great fishing, and Steve Lee and Larry helped put in the reef. And I mean, you said that was in the 80s, correct? Or no, I'm sorry, yeah, you said 80, and then about 83 you started surveying them and checking them out. So that's the cool thing, is you have a reef that's, let's say, 40 years old, and it still produces, and it's amazing for a wide variety of species. You name it, it comes to it, you know, on seasons, gag, snapper, permit, cobia, sharks, Goliaths. So that's the cool thing, is the wide array of species that kind of come and go. And with all the tagging, you know, that's been done with those acoustic transmitters, it pings them when they come by the receivers, and they got them on the tugboat, the barge, and, you know, South Jack, docks barge, fin barge, Gunsmoke, sulfur barge, all the different structures to see their migrational patterns. And, you know, I've helped out with tagging with Bonefish Tarpon Trust, FWC, Sea Grant, you know, different organizations. But the cool thing is learning that data and getting it back and kind of understanding why it is the way it is. Because as a fisherman, we're kind of like researching and just probing the water and testing it out, because I'm not a Excel spreadsheet guy. It's just not my deal. But I'll look at it and be like, all right, I got the information. But me seeing it visually, I can look at it and be like, all right, there's a lot here. Or I can look at the water and be like, all right, it's kind of greenish, or it's blue, or it's purple. And you can see that just by doing it every day, because I travel long distances and I get to see a wide array of species and how they change according to winds, tides, time of year, all that good stuff. So the moral of the story is, I think the more we put out, the more it's going to take pressure off of natural bottom. Let's face it, there's a lot of boaters, there's a lot of people fishing, there's regulations in place, and I don't think a lot of the fish are endangered or gonna go extinct. So it's like, if we put in more, I feel like you only have so much time in a day. So if you go here, you go here, you go here, and you go home. But if you're pounding the same thing every single day, of course, the resource is going to be depleted. But if you mix it up with different zones, couple here, go home. You know, that's why I do my trips, like red snapper season. Of course, they want to catch red snapper. So I'll see if I can catch, you know, sometimes you can catch the limit like that on natural bottom. They're not all on artificial reefs. Like, I'll mix it up. I'll go take the pressure off and be like, all right, guys, let's catch a red snapper. Let's troll, see if we can catch a tuna or wahoo, or, you know, sailfish or mahi or something cool. And in that point, you know, it kind of gives people the opportunity to relax, enjoy the day, you know, chat, eat a sandwich, you know, actually have a conversation, listen to music, and enjoy. The whole reason why we're actually out there is to enjoy it and enjoy the resource, the fish that we're trying to go after, or, you know, see, even if you're not catching it. Or, I mean, on Monday we were running in like 40 miles an hour, and I look over and I see a Portuguese man o' war, and there's a sailfish like eating at the little, what are those little blue with like the white dots? They look like Nemo, but they're under those Portuguese man o' war. Does anybody know? No, they look weirder. Like, they're like, oh, I mean, because you know the tentacles, they're like that purple, but they look like that color. Do you know it? Is that the actual fish? Anyways, the sailfish was like trying to eat that, and I yelled at my man, I'm like, get a bait. So we swung around through the bait. At first he didn't know he needed to drop it back, but we ended up catching the sailfish just randomly. But going into that, it's just like, you never know what you're gonna see. Whale sharks, great whites, you know, that's what keeps me excited to go. If I did the same thing every day, I'm like, that's kind of boring, you know. So, but anybody got any questions or anything? I'll be chilling over there, and feel free to swing by. Yeah.
Well, I think, wait, hang on a sec.
Yeah.
Yeah, because this is a new nonprofit organization
Yes.
that's Jason's developed. And I think one of the take home points for this audience is that they're really key on engaging scientists in the process. And so as they move forward and begin to start to implement the design and putting artificial reefs out there, their goal is to get as much information as possible from that effort and engage the scientific and management community as much as they can.
Oh, yeah.
And monitoring and evaluating the success of their efforts as well. So now you guys all know him. And with that background too, does anybody have any questions?
I got a question, Jason. So, most of your clients out of state, or are they Florida, or is it 50/50?
Well, no, a lot of my clients are, I don't know. It's like I got a lot of Tampa people, I got a lot of Lakeland people, I got a lot of spring break crowd, but like I've kind of geared my business more towards serious fishermen that like want to be there. So like I've kind of weeded out like people that are like, oh, I don't know what I want to catch, because I want to like them to be there first off.
Yeah.
Because I'm going to go through the effort to give them the full show, like from start to finish. It's going to be fun, you know. And then, you know, the fun thing is you get back at the fillet station, they got their fish they wanted, you're filleting the fish, you know, they can kind of reminisce and kind of enjoy the whole process of the day, you know. And I mean, sometimes I don't have to kill anything. It could be all catch and release. If they're like, hey, I don't need any fish, I'm like, all right, I'm cool with that. You know, especially with the permit fishing. I mean, that's one of my big, you know, let's call it a bucket list trip, because that's what people are inquiring on. They're like, oh my God, I want to catch a permit so bad. I'm like, all right, let's put it on the calendar and then hope for the best weather. But even if you're focusing on one thing, they're not going to be sad if they catch something else cool and they're happy about it, you know? So
You do inshore too, or strictly off?
strictly offshore now. Like I used to do both, and now I got the offshore boat, and it's just like, let's do the deal. But also the exciting part about getting into this is we can have more habitat for all of us to enjoy long term. So again, the reefs that they put out, I get to enjoy it, and hopefully the reefs we get out, my kids get to enjoy it. And who doesn't want their kids to enjoy what we've grown up doing, which is awesome. You know, I was born and raised in St. Pete, so I got lucky. You know, my dad would take me fishing when I was born, essentially. And if I got seasick, I'd be in the floor well with like in the dusky with like gags hitting my legs, you know. And then we'd fish around Paso Grill. You know, my mom, she's still alive. My dad passed away, so I also want to get a reef for him as well. And I want to talk to the Pinellas County guy, because I was a St. Pete boy and moved down to Bradenton. So, and I run out of the Manatee River Blinkers Marina. So it's like, for me, it's a straight shot out to the Gulf, which is a cool spot, and it's tucked in there. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I got a question, and I'll start with the state. In Crystal River, we started replanting grasses and got grasses to spread out into a wide area. And what that did is it took individual manatee viewing pressure from isolated spots and spread it all around.
Yes.
In past conversations with you, one thing that I think is interesting about what you're trying to do is bring in floating aggregating devices, so FADs. Typically haven't been a big thing in Florida. With the new pressure and restrictions on bottom fishing, you have carved out a niche in this local community as catching wahoos, tunas, and other pelagic. What have been some of the main successes in that? And do you think that if there's more floating structure, there'll be a bigger market for people strictly going after pelagic?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So like, I mean, a lot of places in the world, they do the FADs, but I know here, the biggest issue is a navigational hazard. So obviously what we talked about is like with Keith is like a 50 to 75 foot clearance. So that's why Keith was mentioning the radio tower that's been successful in other projects. I think the biggest thing is going into is a lot of people talk about is like the high relief, you know. So like in Costa Rica, like I fished the FADs in Costa Rica and they're amazing. Like it's the best marlin fishing in the world. But we have a similar fishery here, but not the habitat to hold them. Like if you fish the steps, you got to kind of get lucky and hang on the dream and hope for the best. But even what the boys are doing up, like Alex Fogg and them up in the northern Gulf, you know, they're killing it. They're putting in FADs and a lot of structure. And the guys in Texas are on that, but the biggest thing with that is I know the navigational hazard is a big issue. But it would definitely, I know for a fact, change the fishery to add more pelagics and take pressure off the bottom fish. Like, so for example, with some of the floating debris I've found offshore, like say I find, I mean, a couple of days ago, we found a chair and it had triple tail on it. We found a hose. I caught a wahoo on it. You know, you find a board from a storm. You know, like in the Keys, obviously, if you find a pallet or whatever, you're going to get your mahi but also too, you got your natural habitat with sargassum, and you got the sargassum, you know, that essentially is floating around, and there's bait living in it and fish living around it. So, I mean, basically something that is non-harmful, doesn't cause navigational issues, and can hold habitat and shade, I think is the biggest thing for that to provide like an amazing pelagic fishery, essentially, I would say, right? So that's what we got to figure out. How do we do that to where everything's all good? You know?
Those people are in the room here today.
Yeah.
Yep. So you guys know where to find Jason. He's right there in the back. Thank
Thank you.
you. Thank you
Appreciate
so
it.
much. All right, our last and final formal speaker for the day before we do our closing remarks is David Walter, the founder and owner of Walter Marine. Reef Maker. But the company was founded in 1968 and formed the division of Reef Maker in 1986. And he has deployed, and his company has deployed over 40,000 artificial reefs to date, plus 20 ships. 55. Oh, I got this from your website. I was off. 55,000 artificial reefs to date, plus 20 ships still, or more than 20? Plus a lot of ships. And they have patented the wave attenuator as well. So he is going to talk a little bit about some of the new Coast Guard regulations and some of the challenges that he has experienced as one of our industry participants today.
Let's advance.
Yeah, or the down there, either one. Yeah, we didn't like the better view.
Good afternoon. Some of you may have heard that the Coast Guard is started taking interest in the deployment of artificial reefs. I started deploying reefs in 1986, and by 1990, I attracted the attention of the Coast Guard. I got this letter from them that said, if you desire to continue a freight for hire operation, I strongly recommend you obtain a certificate of inspection to preclude a violation of vessel inspection law, which carries a civil penalty of up to $2,000 for each day. And it sounds like a simple thing. Well, I'll just get certificated. Well, it's not. And I wrote them, I actually appealed it. I wrote Coast Guard a letter and said, hey, the reefs belong to me, and I take them out and put them on the bottom, and when they touch the bottom, they belong to the public. So how could I sell it? They said, you know what, Mr. Walter, you're right, we're wrong, just carry on like you've been going. So about 1995, some of you are old enough, you might remember a guy that sold a grouper Ghetto. We had a boat in Destin, and then they attacked him in Destin, and he called me because we were friends, and I told him what I did, and he wrote the Coast Guard and did the same thing I did. And the Coast Guard actually wrote us back and made a memo, and it said he had named his vessel, named my vessel, the name of my business, the name of his business, and it said, neither vessel appears to be subject to inspection. From your description in reference to the title of the reef materials would not pass to the customers until after deployment. We deploy private reefs in Alabama. And since the components retain title, since the companies retain title during transportation in the Gulf, the vessels do not appear to be carrying freight for hire. Thus, they are not freight vessels and are not subject to inspection. A full legal memorandum is available. Well, I carried that document for almost 30 years. And every time the Coast Guard visited me, I'd show them this document and they go, okay, sorry. Well, enter Mr. Wayne Bauer of the Little Mo. He was in Texas and he was actually deploying reef material that he did not own. And the Coast Guard put him out of business. He called, I know he called some of the reef coordinators in Florida. He called me and he said, what are you going to do? I'm not going to do anything. I'm fine. He said, he waited about a year and he called me back and he said, David, I'm going to throw you under the bus. It's not fair that you get to deploy artificial reefs and I can't. So, and he did. He got a hold of some admiral in the Coast Guard and the Coast Guard showed up at my place of business and they wrote me this letter in 2019. It said it's been brought to attention these vessels meet the requirement of inspected vessel and require a certificate of inspection. So I showed them my letter. Hey, got this letter. They said, well, Mr. Walter, we destroyed those documents after so many years. So that letter doesn't exist anymore. Therefore, you have to be inspected. Now, if you get charged with a crime and you go to court and you get found innocent, double jeopardy applies and they can never fight you for that. Well, I've appealed this twice, right? No, you have to appeal any Coast Guard decision 3 times. You have to appeal it at the local level, then you have to appeal it to the Coast Guard district that you're in, and then you have to appeal it to Washington, D.C. Only then does it become permanent. Didn't know that. So I spent the last 3 years hiring a law firm, maritime law firm, fighting this. I had 2 senators and a congressman trying to help me, and I lost. So if you say, what's the big deal with certificating a boat? This is my boat. It was completely gone through a shipyard and a refit, and the crane was put on it. It was in perfect condition, but it would not meet Coast Guard regulations. I have not had an accident in 30 years. They said, we're doing this for safety, Mr. Walter. So if you have even though I had these tanks down in the bottom of the boat that were in perfect shape, if you have a piece of metal that has a pit in it, the size of a pencil eraser, that's more than 25% of the thickness of the metal, you got to replace that whole piece of metal. We spent the last 3 months cutting holes in the boat, pulling out perfectly good metal and replacing it with brand new metal. And we finally got that done. The boat is now in the shipyard getting a $350,000 inspection and sandblast and paint job for internals. Well, this is over with. I'm going to have somewhere like $1.2 million just in this Coast Guard certification. The reason I mention this, I know most of you don't operate boats, but you have contractors that do, and this is going to affect the artificial reef business. It's going to drive up the cost. It's going to limit the number of contractors. And to give you an idea, if you guys down here, tugboats, all tugboats now over 26 feet. If they're less than 26 feet, you can get away with anything. You don't have to come under Coast Guard inspection. But if it's over 26 feet, it has to be certificated to subchapter M. Now, those tugboats can go 3 miles offshore and no further, unless they add a different endorsement to their certificate, which requires different safety equipment, life rafts, and different navigation lights, and I'm not sure what else. Then you could get it to go 20 miles. There's another documentation you can get to go to 30 or 50 miles, and then after that, there's an unlimited one. So if you're on the, if you have a subchapter M tug with additional Coast Guard certificates, you can go 20 miles. If you're on the east coast of Florida, you have to use an ABS barge. That's somewhat the same type of thing. It has to go through annual inspections with the Coast Guard. And you have to tow it with a subchapter M tug that's documented, has an endorsement to go whatever distance offshore you want to go. However, if you're on the west coast of Florida, you can get by with any kind of barge you want. You don't have to be, barge does not have to be ABS, not have to be inspected. It does have to be towed or pushed with a subchapter M tug unless it's 26 feet or less. If you have a self-propelled vessel, it has to be subchapter I certificated. And that's the same thing as a freighter that goes all the way around the world. It's the same thing it has to have. And it's not cheap. So I'm just letting you know, I don't know where all this is going. I'm not going to throw anybody under the bus. So if somebody comes up to one of your contractors and says, hey, you got to be certificated, I didn't do it. So anyway, I'm just letting you know what's coming down. And the Coast Guard has now told me that they're going to start looking at everybody. So anyway, thank y'all, and y'all have a good day. Oh, they have a question?
Any questions in here? So typically we do have Coast Guard in the audience, so they're not here today, I don't think. Is anybody from the Coast Guard here? I know Army Corps is here somewhere. No Coast Guard? You don't want to claim it? Okay. Any questions?
I got a question. Does it matter where the funding source comes from, whether it's a municipality, indigo, or private sector?
Well, no, it doesn't. It used to matter when they used to honor what they said. It used to matter whether you own the material or whether somebody else. But evidently that doesn't matter to them anymore.
Real quick, I will say that, you know, the county program manager, we go to contract with a vendor to deploy material using cover bars or any type of equipment. The standard language of those contracts are going to be that you comply with all regulations that are, you know, to your work. So, you know, we're not going to tell you exactly what you have to do, but all the onus is going to be on the contractor, that you're the one that's got to make sure that your vessel complies with everything. So most contracts, I'm sure, are written in the same kind of language. So as a contractor, you know, I would say, yeah, you definitely need to know what rules apply with you. You might get away with it 1,000 times without anyone looking at it, but it takes one time, and you know, we have to say that this is the decision we made, and it definitely affects that contract.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess I'll, you know. Yeah, I appreciate you, David, bringing this to our attention. I was not aware that, you know, that they, dealing with this over the past 3 years. You know, Chuck is absolutely right. That's how all of our contracts will read, but I see us. I'm getting waved up here.
Well, this is important, so I mean, it's all important, but it's key.
Yeah, I think, Dave, you've given us a lot to think about. I'm not, and I think I'd like to try to facilitate as best we can. But working with the Coast Guard is not something that we typically have done directly, because as Chuck mentioned, those are things that usually is in the contract language left up to the contractor. I can communicate when I get back to Tallahassee with our Division of Law Enforcement, Boating and Waterways. I think we might have some Coast Guard liaisons that might be able to help me understand this more and see how we can kind of come to resolution on these public works type projects. Perhaps that's the nexus we can lean on to revert back to some of those earlier determinations. But I don't see a clear answer here. You know, every time I try to work with the Coast Guard, it's very complicated. Each district operates kind of differently, and sometimes independent. District 8 is quite different from District 7. You know, sometimes we're dealing with the Coast Guard division that's just looking at the cleanliness. Other parts of it is looking at the towing part of it, and they don't talk to each other. So it's tough. So if anyone in this room has some ideas, maybe following this meeting, contact me and I could circle back with David and see as a community. I could check with the other states too, to see if this has been dealt with in other areas.
Well, I think,
Michael?
an unfortunate side effect that we probably should start preparing for is it's gonna cost 2 or 3 times, 4 times as much money as deployment. And so I think if you look at it from a state point of view, maybe now is the time to start saying we need more money for the artificial reef program because of stuff like this, or if anyone's gonna be fundraising. I know we ran into it from a different angle where basically it came in 3 times more expensive than expected, and that delayed us 5 years to raise additional funds on it. So there's probably gonna be fewer contractors that are willing to do it. And it's gonna be more expensive to do it, so it's just something that I think we have to be careful.
Yeah, we're getting a handful of hands here. Chantil?
You're going through a still project now. You're told by handful contractors recently to expect at a minimum a 30% increase on deployments. Do you feel that's accurate, or do you feel like you just asked for 210,000 more with an amendment and an extension on the resort grant because of these unexpected costs that have been incurred due to the pandemic?
Well, the contractors like David and others are the ones submitting their proposals. That those costs have been rising due to a number of issues, and insurance, and perhaps Coast Guard is just part of it, but fuel and equipment, all these things that we take for granted, maintaining these large vessels that meet certification, is costing more. So I don't know how much of an opportunity we have to go back to the Coast Guard and see how much ability we have for exempt. Maybe they're closed. Maybe their overall is to close some of these limit the exempt. I just don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. I hope you get away with it. I'll even loan you my
And
letter.
Todd has.
We gotta find something happen
I
out.
think-
But what Dave's talking about is freight. The question really comes to mind. Freight normally applies to delivery, you're delivering an item. We're getting an item that's going down to the sea that becomes public property, so it's not really delivery. It's kind of like burning your own gas as you're going out. So the only argument that we might have is the argument that we're not carrying freight, that we're actually putting something out that becomes part of the public. There's not somebody there taking delivery on the freight. Now you're getting a service, but you're not necessarily, you don't get to own that research. It's owned by the state. Ground.
Yeah.
And in most cases, it's not talking about.
And that thought kind of also reminds me of something that Ed Camp said, how we're, maybe not, and even Bill Seaman, not calling these artificial reefs so much, but more habitat enhancement. And maybe we can put more emphasis on the habitat, the natural resource enhancement. Sometimes that gives us a little more leeway to have that type of exemption.
If our governor gets to be president, maybe he can print the Coast Guard out.
Yeah, well, I had a top maritime law firm, and he took every argument. There's an argument that says, well, once some entity or governmental entity rules on a subject, that they can't ever change that rule years down if nothing has changed with the problem is with me, I was a little different. I build my own reefs and haul my own reefs on my own boat, and probably reef ball might I do the same thing. But if you have concrete rubble and you hire somebody to take it out, that's definitely freight. There's not any way you cannot call that freight. It would be nice if they would, but they wouldn't listen to anything we said. That was just part of our argument. We went by and talked about the reef habitat. We went and talked about all types of things, and then we had several different arguments, and the Coast Guard just nope. And I could have taken them to federal court. It would have taken me a couple of years to get them to court, and then we would have well, I've been out of business those 2 years. So I just threw my hands up, said, I thank God for the BT money. I wouldn't have had the money to do it.
All right. Oh, yeah. So all of these presentations have been recorded all day. And they're all going to be available archived online on the Florida Sea Grant website, like all of our workshops and summits. So we can relive this anytime for sure. Thank you, David, so much
Thank you.
for those comments. Don't blame you. Okay, so I think we've had really good engaging discussion throughout the day, and I promised you guys we would adjourn by 3:30 p.m., which is still the plan, so don't worry. We will let you out exactly, if not earlier than 3:30, so don't worry. I just wanted to give you a couple closing remarks on my end from a facilitator standpoint, and then I'm going to toss the mic to Keith and let him close us out. Before you leave, we reuse these little things. So your badges, if you don't want to keep it, you can keep it if you want, but if you don't, can you just leave it on the table as you exit? And then that's it for me. Thank you guys so much for the day, and I'm going to let Keith close us.
Thank you, Angela. Wow. I mean, I don't know about you all, but this has been kind of a tidal wave of information. You know, we have a lot of new people in the room this year, and I thank all the presenters for giving, you know, great overviews from a kind of a high level, an international level. And then we also had some very specific data points as well. If you zoom in on some of the slides, I mean, it's a lot to digest. So I appreciate Florida Sea Grant for recording all of this. And I encourage all of you to go back and revisit some of these. Same thing with our 2020 virtual summit. You can find elements of what was presented today in an even greater level of detail. Throughout the day, I was taking notes on a number of things that perhaps are directed to my office to help facilitate, but other aspects, you know, directed at the local level. For example, I think Steve leaned over to me, you know, during Bill Seaman's talk, you know, maybe Florida needs to step up to the plate here and at the international level and get people together. So that's one example, perhaps. Jason, I think the work that you've done communicating with Angela and the counties really exemplifies some of the background work that has made Florida's artificial reef program so successful. I've told you and others today that the success of our program is based on these grassroots efforts, the local community, the stakeholders who are using these reefs to drive the decision-making process, you know, and I think that has historically been the success of our programs. This is not something where you can call Tallahassee and say, okay, we want to put reefs here, because we're gonna immediately turn around and want to ask those questions like Ed Camp was showing, you know, why, where, who, you know, and start to check those boxes, connect with our research institute, make sure that we have the information in place to make the right decisions. So I think that, you know, what you're doing in partnering here locally, I encourage that in other places too. There are some of other counties, you know, who are here today, who are, you know, as Pasco County says, you know, getting back into the game again. So I encourage you to find those charter boat captains, find those recreational anglers, retirees, weekend guys, you know, and understand what the needs are in your local community, so we can start to implement some of these programs with the science and information, you know, on hand to make sure that we're doing no harm and benefiting not only the users but the resources as well. So I see a lot of work ahead of us. Like I said, I have one more vacancy to fill, and with that, you know, I hope that perhaps one of the new job orientation steps will be to have them, you know, spend the hours to watch this summit, you know, to kind of get a sense of you know, what lies ahead, especially for Southwest Florida. You know, we travel around the state, and each area of the state has their own unique you know, opportunities, and we heard some of that today, especially with the emphasis on the estuarine programs and the inshore waterways, and And Ryan, I do think that your presentation, on your inshore habitat, even though it's kind of at a smaller scale, I saw ecologically a lot of ideas and concepts that perhaps we can think about, as we manage these species on the offshore habitats as well. So, those are kind of my, I guess, impressions from today. I hope some of you share that. And, I hope we continue to have conversations with each other and with me. I might be kind of hard to get a hold of these days, but please, Carolyn, Eli, and Neil are with me now. And we try to, make sure we're all sharing information with each other so we can report out to the counties and move the program forward. We're a growing state. We have a lot of projects. It's incredible to look back at the old records from the 1970s and 80s. Now we're over this year. We clicked over 4,000 artificial reef patch reefs, and that could be just one reef or multiple structure. So we've clicked that 4,000 patch reef mark, which is a significant milestone for our state. Yeah. Angela, anything else, or are we taking questions, Chuck?
I have a carryover question that you might want to consider from the last item that here, post Michael. And we were talking about how the modules got scattered by the storm. Has there been any study or the recruitment of them dispersed as opposed to put down the way we put them down? In other words, what I'm looking at, a question would be, would we be better on some reefs for recruitment, especially of juveniles, and taking the pressure off to scatter the modules over a greater area?
Yeah,
Has that been done? I mean, because the Michael thing.
Yeah, you could visit our poster over there, and we have that little slide bar. If you haven't checked out that iPad yet, just take a step over there on your way out and move it back and forth to see the pre and post. We actually have not yet updated our artificial reef deployment coordinate list to reflect those new locations, partially because, like you say, I think those reefs that have moved off of their known or published coordinate, now they're providing the benefit of a situation like that. It is providing some refugia. So, but it depends on the species. The work that Will Patterson did, where he compared some unpublished versus published reefs, on red snapper, for example. These fish are moving around. Jason pointed out that clearly. They don't have a home; they have a tail, and they're moving. So he was not able to document, as far as red snapper, any difference between the published and unpublished site. However, a species that has a higher site fidelity, maybe even lionfish is a good example of that. Where they're more affiliated with the structure, you bring in divers and they're removing them, and they will remain off of that site for some period of time until, you have other recruitment from other sites. So it depends on the species.
Well, again, huge kudos to everybody who's in this room from the time out of your busy schedules to join us today and share your knowledge and expertise. And I encourage you to keep building these relationships that you have with each other. Be on the lookout for an email from me next week with a link to this recorded presentation and the resources, as well as a contact sheet. So if you have people that you still want to keep talking to, you'll have that information in your email sometime next week. And then, feel free to hang out as long as you want and keep talking to each other. But we will officially conclude the 2023 Southwest Florida Artificial Reef Regional Workshop, and we look forward to seeing you guys at some point in 2024 or 2025.